fugitive will not be seen today.
This is an ABC News special report. From Washington, live coverage of the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North at the Iran-Contra hearings. Here is Peter Jennings.
Good afternoon. The Iran committees are about to begin their questioning of Colonel North again. This morning's session was very often an emotional one. Colonel North telling the committees he'd never taken a penny for his own use during the Iran-Contra affair, as has been alleged, that he had taken the means to commit suicide when he went on a secret trip to Iran last year, and that when he tried to cover up his acceptance of a security system for his home as a gift, he had committed the grossest misjudgment of his life. It has been pretty powerful stuff. And standing by on Capitol Hill, waiting with us to listen to Colonel North's testimony this afternoon, Brit Hume. Brit, we know a little bit about how Colonel North has impressed the public. An overnight ABC News poll says that 58% believe what he's saying. How are the congressmen reacting?
Peter, I just spoke to Senator Mitchell, who will be one of the questioners when the members finally get their turn. The word he used to describe Colonel North's testimony this morning was, the words he used were very persuasive. I think there's a widespread feeling that today, particularly, Colonel North is doing very well indeed.
Okay, Britt, thank you very much. Senator Inouye.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Colonel session to Congress.
You testified yesterday.
And here is the counsel for the House.
Concerning approval that you received for the plan to use the proceeds of arms sales to Iran for the Contras. And you testified about Admiral Poindexter and the President. Who else, if anyone, and I don't mean to imply anything in the question, but leaving those two people aside, who else in the government was aware of either the plan or the fact of using proceeds of arms sales to Iran for the Contras?
Well, if I may clarify, what I testified to yesterday is my assumption that the President knew, and then I subsequently testified that I was told he did not know. I know that Admiral Poindexter knew. I know that Mr. McFarland knew at a point in time when he was no longer in the government. And Director Casey knew. Aside from that, I can't speak with certainty as to who else inside the government knew for sure, although there were certainly a number of people who, by the time November of '86 came along, certainly had great suspicions or belief that it was happening. But the only ones that I know for sure who I confirmed it with were those three.
Okay, if I may, I'd like to take them and then ask you some questions about some others. When did Mr. McFarland, to your knowledge, first learn that the proceeds from the arms sales to Iran had been used for the Contras?
My recollection is that I first confirmed it with him during the May trip to Tehran. And it was probably on the return leg from that, either at on board the aircraft or as we were changing planes, whatever. We returned in an aircraft to Israel and boarded another aircraft and flew back to the United States. So it was somewhere in that time frame that I can recall specifically telling him.
Do you have any reason to believe he was aware of it earlier?
He may have been. I have seen some of my own notes that would lead me to believe I had talked to him about it, but I don't recall the events. I do specifically recall, however, talking to him about it at the time of our return.
When did Director Casey first learn of it?
Actually, my recollection is Director Casey learned about it before the fact. Since I'm confessing to things, I may have raised it with him before I raised it with Admiral Poindexter. Probably when I returned from the January discussions.
You're referring now to the discussion, the trip during which you had the discussion with Mr. Grabanifar in the bathroom.
Yes. I don't recall raising the bathroom specifically with the director, but I do recall talking with the director, and I don't remember whether it was before or after I talked to Admiral Poindexter about it. But I was not the only one who was enthusiastic about this idea, and Director Casey used several words to describe how he felt about it, all of which were effusive. He referred to it as the ultimate irony, the ultimate covert operation kind of thing, and was very enthusiastic about it. He also recognized that there were potential liabilities and that there was risk involved. I believe that he was accurate given what has now happened.
What kinds of risks did he identify to you?
This very political risk that we see being portrayed out here now. That it could indeed be dangerous, or not dangerous so much as politically damaging.
Do you have any reason to believe that Director Casey, given the political risk, ever discussed the matter with the President?
I have no reason to believe that he did, because he never addressed that to me. I never, as I indicated yesterday, no one ever told me that they had discussed it with the President.
Did Director Casey ever tell you that he was planning to discuss it with the President?
No. Not that I recall.
Did you have other discussions with Director Casey on the subject of use of these arms sales proceeds for the Contras?
Yes, we did. Director Casey, who is very clear in my records of communications with him, is a man for whom I had enormous respect. I respected him as a man of incredible experience, probably the most well-read man I have ever met and dealt with on a direct face-to-face basis. I watched Director Casey on trips when I'd travel with him read an entire book in one plane flight. And in fact, on one occasion, he finished an entire book. As I recall, it was Paul Johnson's book, Modern Times, which is like this in paperback. And then I noticed he was working on the yellow legal pad as we were flying along. And I said, "What'd you do with the book?" He said, I'm tired of reading. I'm decided to write my own. And he'd finished Paul Johnson's book, which he then gave to me. Director Casey and I talked at length on a variety of occasions about the use of those monies to support other operations besides the Nicaraguan operation. And you no doubt have seen record of my accounting of other activities that were planned beyond the Nicaraguan resistance. We always assumed, not just Director Casey and I, but all those of us who worked within the government on this problem of democracy in Central America, that there would come a time again, as indeed it did, where the Congress would make available the monies necessary to support the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. And at various times he and I talked about the fact that it might be necessary at some point in the future to have something, as he would put it, to pull off the shelf and to help support other activities like that. Now, none of those, aside from the ones that we talked about in terms of cooperation with Israel, the ones I referred to in my notes as TA 1, 2, and 3, or TH 1, 2, and 3, I don't recall exactly which. Aside from those operations, he was looking forward to the possibility of needing to support other activities beyond that. And that's why I'm not exactly certain as to what perhaps was intended beyond the use of those monies for support for the Nicaraguan resistance and the other purposes that I described to you earlier, in that I had, I think, communicated that to General Secord, and he did prepare a layout which showed how other of those commercial entities could be used to support activities in other places besides Central America and besides the U.S.-Israeli operations, besides the hostage recovery operations. None of those plans were ever put to fruition before all of this was terminated. But we did talk, he and I, about that, and I may have mentioned it at some point to Admiral Poindexter, although certainly not in the same detail that Director Casey and I talked about it. It is possible, although I don't recall it, that I may have talked to Mr. McFarland about it.
When you say about it, it is the use
application
of funds for some other projects besides the Contras.
Yes. Well, I am certain that I talked to Admiral Poindexter about the Israeli projects, the ones that are abbreviated with a TA or a TH in the records that I provided to the committee.
Did you ever tell Director Casey that funds had actually been used to support the Contras? That is, funds arising out of these Iranian arms sales?
Oh, yes.
And I take it on more than one occasion?
Yes.
Was there anyone else in the CIA who was aware that funds from the Iranian arms sales were used to support the Contras?
I cannot say with certainty that others were for sure aware. But you must realize that they were getting the same intelligence I was. It was, Director Casey was very concerned that others, for example, I mentioned Mr. Furmark, but that others besides Mr. Furmark were aware of that. Director Casey mentioned several times to me that my telephone calls in and out of my office to and from Central America were undoubtedly intercepted by the Soviet KGB collection site at Lourdes, Cuba. And he believed that that's how perhaps the initial connection between General Secord and I was made public. Undoubtedly, there were people at CIA who had access to this raw intelligence, who made surmise or came to conclusions about it, but I never recall confirming to anyone else at CIA those suspicions. It is entirely possible that others in both the Intelligence Directorate as well as the Operations Directorate were indeed witting but didn't want to know more than they knew. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to implicate other people or anything like that, but a detailed reading of day-to-day intelligence would certainly indicate that if it weren't from Iran, it had to be from somewhere else, and they could certainly read the traffic and derive from certain things that in the intelligence that I was engaged with that there was an Iranian connection as well as a Nicaraguan connection. I'm certain that some people must have concluded that.
Were there people in the CIA who were directly aware from you or from working with you that there was a difference between the amount of money that was paid into General Secord's accounts and the amount of money that was paid into the CIA accounts?
Again, certainly from the intelligence, they would be aware of that. The intelligence we were collecting that I referred to yesterday, and I've since gotten guidance as to how to refer to it, but the intelligence that I referred to yesterday clearly indicated that there was a difference between what the government of the United States was charging and what was actually being provided. So yes, it would be visible to those people that there was a difference.
Was that discussed with people that you worked with directly at the CIA on this Iranian project?
It may have been, counsel, but I don't recall a specific session in which I sat down and said, okay, guys, the Iranians are providing $8 for this, and we're only giving the government $5 because that's all the government wanted. But I'm sure there were people who came to those conclusions. I do not recall confirming to them what the delta, the difference, was being used for.
Now, you had a interview with Attorney General Meese on the 23rd of November 1986, at which the issue of the use of these proceeds for the Contras was discussed.
Yes.
Do you have any reason to believe that the Attorney General was aware prior to that time that the proceeds from the Iranian arms sales were used to support the Contras?
No, I don't. I have no reason to believe that he was. But when he asked me, I told him.
Now, when he asked you, did you tell him that the difference was in accounts controlled by General Secord, or did you tell him that the difference went from the Israelis directly to Contra accounts?
I do not recall the specifics of that conversation. It was to put it mildly, a very long night before and a very difficult week prior to. And I have no real recollection of that interview other than the fact that it did indeed happen on Sunday afternoon. And that when the Attorney General asked me, holding one of the two of us holding the memo of April, which delineated as a part of that memo that residuals would be used for aiding the Nicaraguan resistance, I do recall that the Attorney General asked me point blank, did this happen? I told him that transaction did not happen. He then asked me if anything like that had ever happened, or words to that effect, and I told him it had.
Did you listen to his press conference on the 25th of November?
Yes, I did.
Are you aware, or do you recall him saying in his press conference that the money had gone straight from an Israeli account into Contra accounts and had not been handled by any U.S. persons?
I don't recall that specific part of it, but I do recall that there was something like that said, yes.
And did he get that from you?
He may well have, and I'm not denying that at all. I want to make something very clear. I did not have on that day as good a feel or as good an understanding of the actual financial transactions that I came to have in the days thereafter. And I mean, first of all, it's important that you understand that we believed, at least I was led to believe, that our intelligence services saw Mr. Ghorbanifar as an Israeli agent. He's an Iranian. At least that's where he was born and lived. But that he was viewed by certainly Director Casey and other members of the intelligence community as an agent of the Israeli intelligence services. And so my assumption was that if an Israeli agent was giving money to an account, in this case an account which included the Nicaraguan resistance, that there would be an Israeli connection to that. I may well have been wrong, because in the subsequent days, in fact later that day or perhaps the day afterwards, it was described to me differently. That no, the monies came directly from other places and went in there, and a whole host of other people, to include Mr. Khashoggi and others, were mentioned. But I did not know that at the time I was talking to the Attorney General.
But you knew that the residue, the residuals as you've called them, went into the custody of Mr. Secord and his Swiss bank accounts, didn't you?
And I did know that they did go to the support of the Nicaraguan resistance and those other activities I have described, at the time I talked to him, and that's what I tried to express.
No, that wasn't quite my question. My question was, you knew that the residuals had gone into accounts controlled by General Secord, not accounts controlled by the Contras.
That is correct.
And do you recall the Attorney General saying that they had gone directly from Israeli accounts into accounts controlled by the Contras?
I do not recall that specific wording, but I don't dispute that he said it. I'm sure if it's on the transcript, he did.
My question is, did he get that from you?
He may well have.
But you knew at the time that that was not true.
Well,
He didn't say that he got it from him. It's the second time. This is now the third time.
He said he may have, and my question is, you knew that it wasn't true. Whether he got it from you or not, it was not true.
Well, again, Mr. Niels, what I told the Attorney General that afternoon was the truth as I knew it. And that's what I always did. And that's what I'm doing now. The important thing is that I tried to reconstruct in an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever I was in the Attorney General's office, for him, answers to his questions that answered what he wanted to know. I'm sorry, I missed the question.
I don't think there is one. But I will ask you.
Well, I guess what I want to do is make sure that I'm clear on it. What I do recall, and it was important enough for me to then call Admiral Poindexter and try to get a hold of Mr. McFarland, who I think I eventually got through to also, is that I do recall telling the Attorney General the truth about the fact that there had been funds diverted, if that's the word you want, or the residuals from the transaction, or from different transactions, transferred to the use of the Contras. I don't recall the specifics of what else I told them. I mean, that was, for me, the deepest, darkest secret of the whole activity. And I think I told the Attorney General that part, too, although I don't recall it specifically. But as far as the specifics of the rest of what I told him about whose accounts and things like that, I do not recall.
Were there any other people in the NSC that were aware of the use of the proceeds from the Iranian arms sales for the Contras?
I don't know. I may have apprised my staff. I don't recall whether I actually told Miss Hall, or she certainly typed many memos on it. I think it's possible that I had talked to Lieutenant Colonel Earl about it. I don't believe I talked to Commander Coy about it. And I don't believe that Miss Brown knew about it. I don't believe that Mr. McDaniel, who was the deputy to Admiral Poindexter, knew. Nor do I believe that Mr. Keel or Dr. Keel knew until the very end.
Commander Thompson?
I don't know. I do not recall a discussion with Commander Thompson on that issue until the very end of my tenure.
You recall discussing this subject with anyone else other than the people that you've already mentioned today and yesterday?
I don't recall it, no.
Did you, going back to November 21st again, did you on November 21st meet with the Attorney General, either alone or with others?
1986. On November 21st?
Yes.
it is possible that that issue came up in a discussion that I had on the 21st of November with Mr. McFarland. Obviously also with Admiral Poindexter, both of whom I met with that day.
Did you meet with the Attorney General that day?
I don't have any recollection of it, and I don't see any record of it in anything that I have tried to refresh my memory with.
You seem to be looking at some pieces of paper. What are they?
Stuff I gave you, and the stuff I've assembled as work product with counsel since then. I mean, it's that you have that.
Obviously, the witness anticipated you'd have a few questions, and he tried to review as many of his materials as possible, including the 6 feet of records which you provided.
I have no recollection of a meeting with the Attorney General on the 21st.
Do you have a recollection of telling Colonel Earl on the 21st that you had asked the Attorney General how much time you had?
No.
Do you recall telling Colonel Earl that you had asked the Attorney General if you had 24 or 48 hours?
No. I do not recall that at all. Although there was another issue that was at stake here, and an issue that we had, whether I actually communicated with the Attorney General on or not, I don't remember. But there was an investigation of an airline, and I know that we were trying to, we had asked the Attorney General to delay an investigation on that airline because that airline had not only provided support to the Nicaraguan resistance, that was the matter that they were being investigated for, and that airline had provided support to the transfer of U.S. weapons from the United States to Israel and then from Israel to Iran. And my concern was that in trying to answer the legitimate and I think straightforward answers that were being asked, or trying to answer the questions that were being asked about that airline's role in support for the resistance, that investigation was going to uncover that airline support for the transfers to Iran. And our concern, at least my concern, I don't want to speak to everyone's, but certainly my concern, certainly Director Casey's concern, and I believe Admiral Poindexter's concern, was that pursuing that investigation was going to disrupt ongoing efforts to achieve the release of another hostage, as well as potentially compromise the second channel and cause people to die. And so what we were anxious to do was to postpone that investigation, not interfere with it from a criminal investigation perspective, but to ensure that we had done all we could to, one, get people out of Iran if they needed to get out, and to ensure that any hostages we could get out were released. And that may be what I was referring to in terms of 24 to 48 hours. That was an ongoing action almost up to the time I departed. I do not recall talking to Colonel Earl about 24 hours left in the NSC or anything like that. I don't think that. I had told Admiral Poindexter several times, I think perhaps it started right after the Hassenfuss aircraft was shot down, and Captain Cooper and Buzz Sawyer were killed, 2 brave men who were supporting the resistance, that I knew things were coming down and that I was prepared to leave at any point. And I know I talked to Admiral Poindexter on the 21st and told him that I thought I had to leave right away. And I know that I'd said that several times before, but we were then at the point where I thought that it was important to diffuse the controversy, that I be relieved, that I be transferred. And I say that because I had made it clear to Mr. McFarland I made it clear to Mr. Casey, and I made it very clear to Admiral Poindexter that I recognize that there would come a time when you may have to have a political, I emphasize the word political, fall guy or scapegoat or whatever. I never in my wildest dreams or nightmares envisioned that we would end up with criminal charges. It was beyond my wildest comprehension, right up until the 25th.
I take it you did meet on the 21st with Admiral Poindexter?
Yes.
And did he advise you that representatives from the Attorney General's office were going to be coming in over the weekend to look at documents?
Yes, he did.
Did you ask him how much time you had?
I may have. I don't recall saying that specifically. I think what he told me, if I remember properly, is that they would be in tomorrow. And that wasn't an issue of, whether they'd be in at 8 or whether they'd be in at 10, but they were there in the morning. In fact, they were there before I got there in the morning, if I remember correctly, on the morning, Saturday morning of the 22nd. And I had already laid out on my desk, not my desk, but on the table in my office, all of the files that were pertinent to the Iranian initiative, all the files that remained on the Iranian initiative.
Okay, so at the time of your conversation with Admiral Poindexter, you did not have 24 hours between the time of the conversation and the time the Attorney General's people were going to come in looking at documents.
I'm uncertain at this point as to what time of day I talked to the Admiral about that, but I was told, at some point on Friday that they would be there the following day.
Did he purport, to the best of your recollection, to tell you anything that the Attorney General had said on that subject?
No, my recollection is that the issue was a fact-finding inquiry, I think that's the way it was put, regarding the September and November 85 shipments. And that's what I recall. There may have been more to that conversation, but that's what I recall.
Did there come a time in November of 1986 or earlier in which the Attorney General advised you that you should get yourself a lawyer?
I don't recall him saying that to me. What I do recall is Director Casey telling me that, and I think maybe he said the Attorney General suggested it. And I'm not entirely certain of that, but I do remember Director Casey mentioning 2 specific reasons to get a lawyer. One was that he expected there to be a civil suit similar to the one that was already lodged in Florida against General Secord and others regarding the Nicaraguan resistance, and another one by associates of Mr. Furmark or others who were alleging that I was responsible, or that General Secord or both of us were responsible for the fact that Mr. Ghorbanifar had not paid them. There was another reason, and that was that the Congress had initiated a proposal, and I don't know what form that proposal took, but there was a proposal in '86 to convene an independent counsel to investigate, as I was told. I never recall seeing a piece of paper on this. I don't recall now seeing a piece of paper on it, but that there was a proposal from the Congress to the Attorney General to investigate me and my role in support for the Nicaraguan resistance. And that was through an independent counsel. And I think it was Director Casey that pointed that out to me. I don't recall the Attorney General recommending to me that I seek counsel. I do remember several occasions in which Director Casey urged that I seek counsel. by the way, at no time did he ever say for criminal activity. I mean, he specifically mentioned a civil suit. I mean, after all, he reminded me frequently that he was a lawyer, and by his definition and others, a good one.
Did you, after you learned that the Attorney General's people were going to come in on Saturday, tell Mr. McFarland that you were going to have a shredding party?
No, I don't recall ever using the words shredding party. I may have told Mr. McFarland, as I know I told Admiral Poindexter, albeit erroneously, that I had destroyed the records pertaining to the use of Iranian funds to support the Nicaraguan resistance. I may have told him that point blank. I don't recall the specific conversation. I also don't recall, I mean, it's just not my vernacular to use the word shredding party. Not the way I talk.
Did you, in words or substance, tell Mr. McFarland that you were planning to shred documents on Friday, the 21st of November?
Again, I think if I did refer to this with Mr. McFarland, and I don't recall the conversation, but if I did, I probably would have said the same thing that I had already assured Admiral Poindexter earlier in the day, or perhaps at some point in the day, maybe it was later, that don't worry about that, it's already taken care of. Those documents are gone. I was wrong. There was one left. And I had believed at that point in time that they were all gone.
I'm going to turn back to the subject that we were on yesterday afternoon, namely the Contras. I think that you had testified yesterday about the efforts to raise monies for the Contras after the Boland Amendment had come into effect. Did you also endeavor to procure arms for the Contras?
Yes.
And did you receive, for example, lists of arms from Mr. Calero?
Yes.
And I take it you contacted General Secord and asked him whether he would be willing to endeavor to purchase the arms and sell them to the Contras.
And others. I mean, I contacted a number of people, to include General Singlov and others.
And I take it you made, in some instances, specific efforts to obtain particular kinds of arms, such as blowpipe missiles, for example.
Yes, I did.
And I take it that, I think you've already testified to this, that you, on one occasion, interceded with Country 4.
You have to allow me to... Yes.
To facilitate a delivery of arms to the Contras.
That's correct.
And I take
among others, I'm willing to...
Among other countries with whom you interceded in a similar way, I take it, is what you're saying. And indeed, I think that you've probably seen a document in which you endeavored to reward a Central American country that had provided end-user certificates.
That's correct.
And I take it that these...
I didn't see the document. I wrote it. I'll stand up and take that.
And I take it you had communications with officials of that country in advance of writing that document.
That's correct.
And you told them that you were going to try to get them some help as a way of rewarding them for the help they'd given to the Contras.
Let me be very specific about that. I do not recall ever telling any country or representative of any country that if they did this, that we would do that. What is very important, and I tried to articulate this yesterday, is that others in other countries and other Americans very clearly saw that help to the Nicaraguan resistance was in the best interest of those countries and was in the best interest of the United States of America. And those other countries, in almost every case, without even any prodding, stepped up and wanted to help. And so when I met with somebody, it didn't take a great deal of pushing. What I'm saying to you, counsel, is that there was a very clear recognition, particularly in Central America, that there was a disaster at hand, that they saw, in the words of one head of state, that they were in the mouth of the lion. And I have given you notes of my meetings with a number of heads of state. Quite honestly, counsel, I don't understand why I had to give you those notes. I would have thought under normal circumstances that they would have been accorded what we used to call executive privilege. Those were meetings I had with heads of state and representatives of other countries in the conduct of the foreign policy of the United States of America. And I honestly believe to this day, sir, that those ought not to be handed out and bandied about, that they were private communications, as I was authorized to make by a representative of our executive branch in discussions with those people who represented their governments. And when the head of state of that country said to me, "You must understand, Colonel, that we are in the mouth of the lion, and you, Americans, hold the lion's tail," that what he was talking about was the fact that they could be devoured by what was going on inside Nicaragua. They saw the Leninist totalitarian regime in Managua as a disastrous threat to their own safety, the security of their people, and the opportunity for economic development. And I didn't have to push these people. All I had to do was nod and say we would be grateful. And indeed, I believe we should be. And so when I met with the representatives of any one of those countries on that list for that purpose, it didn't take prodding. All it took was saying we would be grateful. And indeed, I think we ought to be.
I think the question was, I take it that you sought to reward this country for the help that it had given in getting arms to the Contras.
I sought in the memorandum that I prepared to acknowledge what they had done. I also sought to point out in that memorandum that that country, which we don't have listed as a number here, but that particular country was suffering from a guerrilla war sponsored by the Soviet Union and Cuba and Nicaragua, and that they were in desperate straits and they needed help. They needed economic help and they needed security assistance. And the memorandum that I attached also indicated that they had provided assistance to the Nicaraguan resistance in the form of end-user certificates. That I never told the representatives of that country that if they gave us those, we would get something else to them. That's an important factor. I didn't make promises based on a quid pro quo.
Well, I'd like you to turn in that case to Exhibit 145. It's in Book 6. Do you have that in front of you?
I have Exhibit 140, did you say 5 or 6?
145.
Right.
Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
And that's a document, memorandum from you to Mr. McFarlane.
It is.
And it deals with this Central American country, and it's titled Aid to the Nicaraguan Resistance.
That's correct.
And it recommends that the National Security Advisor, Mr. McFarlane, send a letter to the Secretaries of State and Defense, among others.
Yes, that's correct.
And the letter itself is a suggestion of providing some assistance to the Central American country.
That is correct.
And in your memo, you say, at the end of the memo on page 2, once we have approval for at least some of what they have asked for, we can ensure that the right people in that country understand that we are able to provide results from their cooperation on the resistance issue. Now, you wrote that. Was that your intention?
That was one of my intentions. But it is very clear from the attached memo what the real problem is there, too. And the attached memo talks about, in recent weeks, there appears to have been an increase in guerrilla attacks and subversion in that country.
And indeed, you indicate in the memo at page 1 that the real purpose of your memo is to find a way by which we can compensate the Central American country for the extraordinary assistance they are providing to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. And you also recommend that the letter that goes to the Secretaries of Defense and State, and this is on page 2, not refer to the arrangements which have been made for supporting the resistance.
That is correct. I don't deny a single word that's in there. But what I'm saying to you, and the point I was trying to make, is I did not tell the representatives of that country blanked out there that if they did this, then we would do that. Never did I do that.
But you wanted this done for the purpose expressed at the end of page 2, which is so that you can ensure that the right people in the Central American country understand that we are able to provide results from their cooperation on the resistance issue.
I do not deny that.
But you didn't want the Secretaries of Defense and State who were being asked to provide these results to know why they were doing it.
Let me be more specific than that. I did not want the memo that you see at tab I, which is sent to the Honorable George P. Schultz, Caspar Weinberger, William Casey, and General Vesey, which would be reviewed by hundreds of people en route to their offices, to have that reference in it. And as I said yesterday, Counsel, it was fairly well known, certainly to those men, although they may all deny it, what I was doing. There came a time when the man at the top of that list, at the occasion of the retirement of Ambassador Robert Oakley, took me aside just weeks before I was summarily fired, put his arm around my shoulder, and told me what a remarkable job I had done keeping the Nicaraguan resistance alive. There is no doubt that they knew what I was doing. And yet I didn't think it was necessary that the hundreds of staffers who would see that memo on the way to their front offices had a clear recognition for what I was doing. I didn't seek the credit, and I didn't want the blame. I was simply willing to take the fall if somebody needed a political scapegoat. That's what I was willing to do.
I take it one of the other things which you did was to organize a resupply operation in Nicaragua, for Nicaragua.
I helped do that.
And
yes.
Indeed, you asked General Secord if he would be willing to run it himself, did you not?
That is correct.
And you also asked Ambassador Tams to help open a southern front.
That is correct.
And you also asked him to help out on the resupply operation.
I don't know that I asked him to specifically help on the resupply operation. I did ask for his help and received it in trying to obtain the use by virtue of a lease or a planned sale of real estate in that country for the purposes of building an airfield that would be used for supporting the Nicaraguan resistance, yes.
And I take it that one of the purposes for the airstrip was as an emergency landing place for the resupply operation.
And a place to fly in small planes in and out of, yes.
And just so we're clear, I take it a resupply operation involves the flying of goods, including arms, inside Nicaragua and dropping them to Contras that were stationed there and needed to be resupplied.
You said it.
And I take it that you asked others to help out in obtaining this airstrip. There's a Mr. Haskell who has been referred to in some of your documents as Mr. Olmsted, who I take it you knew and asked to help out in obtaining the property and developing it.
I did. and I'm pleased to note that he helped.
And I take it that, among other things, you interceded with third countries in an effort to obtain airplanes.
Yes. And other things, as we already know.
And I take it this resupply operation eventually got started and was operational sometime in 1986?
I don't want to get pinned down to an exact date when it got going, but it did get going.
And you obtained certain secure communication devices, KL-43s?
Yes, I did.
And distributed them to members of the resupply operation?
And others, that's correct. American citizens.
And I take it you utilized these, and so did they, to communicate with respect to the air resupply operation?
And other matters. I would point out, for the benefit of the committee, that Director Casey had on several occasions indicated to me how vulnerable our communications were to intercept from the Soviet signals intelligence site at Lourdes, Cuba, and that his suspicion was that our communications were being read altogether too frequently, and that I should seek some type of communication support, which I did. The KL-43s were used for that purpose, and others.
And you sent and received messages relating to the resupply operation on that KL-43?
Many.
And I take it that the messages that were sent to you were in many instances typed up by your secretary?
Yes.
And I take it they were among the documents which were shredded?
Among the documents, yes. Apparently I didn't shred all of them, however.
And among other things, you directed those who were operating the resupply operation down in Central America with respect to when they should make drops, how they should make them, where they should make them, and so on.
I don't think that directed is the right term, and I'm not trying to back away from any of the things that I did. It is hard to direct a war from a desk in Washington, and I wasn't trying to direct a war from a desk in Washington. I provided as much support for those activities as I was physically able. I went down frequently to coordinate with people in the region, and I would receive and try to coordinate those activities based on information that I received from a multiple of sources. And so directing, I don't think, is quite the right phrase to use.
But you did from time to time give instructions about where items should be dropped,
yes.
When they should drop, how they should be dropped.
Well, again, I mean, they're going to be dropped by parachute no matter what, but I would have a communications in that would indicate that we needed a unit in a certain place, needed a certain number of items, and I would pick up the phone in the KL-43 and ask those guys to see if they could do that. Sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't. You say directing, I don't think that I ever sent out, I direct you to do the following at such and such a time.
Why don't we just turn to Exhibit 88? I believe that's in Book 4. You have that in front of you.
I have Exhibit 88. Begins with a unit.
Yes. And up at the top it says FM Good, G-O-O-D-E.
Yes.
I take it you are good?
I was very good.
And this is a message that was from you, I take it?
It was.
And it discusses, does it not, a proposed drop of weapons?
Yes.
Indeed, in the first paragraph it says the unit to which we wanted to drop in the southern quadrant of Nicaragua is in desperate need of ordnance supply. And then you discuss various plans. In one sentence it reads, have therefore developed an alternative plan which, and the code name of the chief of the Central American Task Force is blanked out.
On my copy, it does not, but I understand.
Has been briefed on and in which he concurs. Then down below, you say, on any night between Wednesday, April 9th and Friday, April 11th, these supplies should be dropped by the C-23 in the vicinity of, and there are coordinates which are blanked out.
Not on mine, but I know the place well.
The aircraft should penetrate Nicaragua across the Atlantic coast south of.
Yes.
There's another word blanked out.
Not on mine, but I know it.
Call signs, frequency and zone marking, light diagram to be provided to Ralph at, and another place is blanked out.
Not on mine.
By the new UNO, sir, operator, we are taken care of.
Right.
Hope we can make this happen the right way this time. If we are ever going to take the pressure off the northern front, we have got to get this drop in quickly. And then you say, please make sure that this is retransmitted via this channel to, there's a blank, Ralph, Sat, and Steele. Owen already briefed and prepared to go with the L-100 out of, another place is blanked out, if this will help. Again, I take it this message was sent by you, and I take it this was not atypical of other messages that you sent dealing with the same kinds of issues.
That is correct.
By the way, this document was obtained from Mr. Secord, and it is marked top secret. Now, is it normal for a purely private operation to have its documents classified?
Private companies all over the United States of America who do business with or for the government of the United States have classified documents probably at a much higher level than even that in terms of compartments. I would also point out that the KL-43 device, if I recall correctly, and I haven't used one in 7 months, but I used it a lot when I had one, automatically put, I think, a code on the transmission. In any event, I see nothing unusual with that.
And I take it that you would agree with the proposition that this resupply operation was doing business with or for the United States?
They were certainly doing it to benefit the foreign policy of the United States of America. I will certainly agree with that.
And was it in furtherance of a covert operation being run by the National Security Council?
It was in furtherance of the foreign policy of the President of the United States to support the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
Was it?
An activity that I was coordinating, that I wrote policy papers on, and on which I carefully kept my superiors apprised of what I was doing.
And I take it, among other things that you did, was direct monies to various Contra leaders and other persons in Central America.
I did, as I testified this morning.
And some of those were carried down by Mr. Owen?
Yes, they were.
And some of them were taken there by General Secord or people working under his direction?
Yes, and others.
And I take it that Mr. Owen did a number of things in furtherance of the support of the Contras.
Yes, he did. Thank God.
Indeed, you had a name for him. I take it was the Courier.
I don't recall giving him that name, but I do recall that his documents would come in marked TC.
And that stood for the Courier?
Yes.
And as you've already said, he would carry money down from your office to various Contra leaders?
Yes.
And he scouted the airstrip?
I guess he did, yes. I'm not too sure. Yeah, I guess that was prior to Olmsted.
And he would bring you a list of weapons from the Contras that they wanted?
That's right, among other things.
And he carried intelligence from you down to the Contras for particular operations?
That's correct.
Indeed, I think he testified before this committee that he was, in his words, your eyes and ears in the Contra movement.
I don't recall his testimony, but I won't dispute the description.
And I take it that you contacted other people for the purpose of having them do or talk to the Contras about doing special operations.
I did. Among other things, yes. And I keep saying among other things because I don't want you to leave this room and think that that's all we did. And what you've just described was a lot. And it kept us up for many long, sleepless days and nights and away from home for many days at a time, a lot of nights. We also worked very hard to unify this resistance movement. And I would point out, without taking undue credit or having undue credit given to those with whom we worked, that this is the only anti-communist resistance movement that ever unified. We haven't succeeded in doing that in Afghanistan. We didn't succeed in doing that in Angola or Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, or other places where resistance movements have grown up to fight communism. It happened here. It happened here because I think there were so many people working so hard for a unified purpose. And that was a lot of what we did. We also delivered food and clothing and medical supplies, and provided prosthetic limbs for people with their arms and hands blown off, and their legs, and tried to look after the families of those people who had been killed or badly wounded and were no longer productive wage earners. And so there was a lot done. In a word, Director Casey said it was a full-service covert operation. And I'm not too sure that's a bad description. There was a lot of people who cared. And I say we cared because a lot of us, like Rob Owen and General Secord and Bill Haskell and myself, came to know the young campesino who was fighting this war. These are young men and women who gave up everything they had, and they fled a totalitarian communist regime. And they fled to another country because they could no longer live within the one that they'd been born in. And they took up arms. I didn't create the Nicaraguan Contra or the Nicaraguan freedom fighter, and the CIA didn't create it. The Sandinistas created it. And we all cared enough to do all of those things, not just the way you have left it, sending guns, sending guns, sending guns. It was all of that, Counsel, as best we were able.
And I take it one of the ways you got the leaders to unify was to send substantial amounts of cash down to them.
People who are going to give up their lives and their livelihoods to join a resistance movement need to feed their families. And so when it became necessary to help them eat and put a roof over the heads of their families, to join a political and military opposition to the communist regime in Managua, we sent money. Yes.
And in one case, you sent a total of $225,000 to one leader.
I give up who?
Where we have been avoiding mentioning particular names, but there is a particular leader who was sent $225,000 over approximately a year-and-a-half period out of the Swiss bank accounts under General Secord's control.
May I suggest that if you want accurate testimony here, that you provide the colonel with the name on a piece of paper, and let's see if he has a response to it. Thank you, sir.
While you're looking for the piece of paper, the amount may be $225,000. It might well be higher. But I don't think the committee ought to be left with the impression that he was bribed or she was bribed into joining this movement. These are people who felt deeply, perhaps even more so than I, because it was their country. And I don't know that anybody was ever bribed to join the Nicaraguan resistance, no matter who the person is or how much he got. I think that they fought as best they were able, and they used the monies that I provided for them to support the cause that they believed in. In particular, that man, who after all, had been a part of the movement to throw out Somoza. And that's important for you to understand. This man joined up with what he had hoped to be a democratic opposition. And he had the revolution that he worked for stolen from him. And yes, I sent money to that man. And I know, because I saw the product of it, that he helped form a Southern Front with that money. And if it helped him to live and to feed his family, good. And there's nothing wrong with that, counsel. Nothing.
I'd like to ask you some questions now about who in the U.S. government was aware of this full-service operation.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to ask you a few questions now about who in the U.S. government was aware of this full-service operation. Was Mr. Abrams at the State Department?
Well, I certainly believed he was.
Well, did you ever talk to him about it?
Yes.
Now, what aspects of it did you discuss with him?
Well, let me describe the situation. You're in a meeting with the people who are in the business of formulating American policy and trying to coordinate what activities we can in the region. And the meeting goes, we desperately have got to do something about X, Y, or Z. Ali? Now, as I just indicated to you a few moments ago, when Secretary Shultz took me aside at Ambassador Bob Oakley's retirement, I knew what he meant. He didn't have to say, you did a great job on the L-100 resupply on the night of 9th of April. He knew in sufficiently eloquent terms what I had done. And as I said to you, counsel, I didn't walk around bragging. I didn't walk around saying, hey, look at me. I sought to avoid that. I did not seek the credit, and I didn't want the blame. I'm willing to accept the blame for what I did. And I've told you a good bit of that here, and some of it has not been easy. I honestly believe that there were many, many people within the executive branch who had a grasp, if not in specific detail, but in sufficient detail, that they knew who to turn to when they wanted something done. And so when the airplane, being flown by Captain Bill Cooper and co-piloted by Buzz Sawyer, two of the braver people I've ever met on this planet, was shot down out of the skies over Nicaragua by a surface-to-air missile, I was the person who was called to raise the money to pay for the consular services to retrieve their bodies.
Who called you?
Mr. Abrams.
I'd like
Why
you to
would
turn
he
to
have
Exhibit
turned to
94.
me if he didn't know I was doing it?
Turn to Exhibit 94. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
And is that a note that you took on your spiral notepads of a conversation with Mr. Abrams on the 25th of April, 1986?
It appears to be.
And is that of a meeting with Mr. Abrams?
Well, it says meeting with Elliot, and that's the only Elliot that I can recall. Although I take that back. I do know other Elliots, but I'm sure that given the subject matter, that's what it pertains to.
And one of the things that's written there is, well, there are a number of items written under it. I take it those are matters that you discussed with Mr. Abrams at the meeting.
I see the notation, counsel. I do not recall that. What year is this? Must be 86 if it's
86.
Ambassador Abrams. And it says, I don't even know what the first note means at this point. Supplies for Southern Front, that's the second item. Air base open in blank, aircraft for blank, and 100 blowpipes. BPs. That's not the gas station.
Did you discuss those subjects with Mr. Abrams at that meeting, to the best of your recollection?
I do not have any recollection of that meeting, but I do not deny that I discussed those at various points in times with Mr. Abrams and others.
I take it there came a time when you gave Mr. Abrams the identity of a bank account in Switzerland.
Yes.
Which was the Lake Resources account.
It was.
And would you describe the circumstances under which you gave him that account?
Well, honestly, without being able to refresh my memory, all I remember is that at some point in time, I gave him a sheet of paper or a card or whatever with the account number on it. And I knew at the time that he was going to, either he or someone from the Department of State was going to talk to a representative from, what country are we calling them? I guess they get to be called by their own name. A representative from Brunei. I cannot recall exactly when that was. It must have been sometime in 1986.
Did you tell him anything about the account?
I told him that it was an account in which he could determine what he wanted done with the monies in that account. That it would be under U.S. rather than foreign control.
When you say foreign, do you mean U.S. as opposed to Nicaraguan?
U.S. as opposed to any other. In other words, it wouldn't have to be in the... A U.S. person would have control over the account. That it wouldn't be a foreigner of some other banking company or some other country or whatever. That's what I recall.
Did you tell him that it was a pre-existing account, one that you were already using for the Contras?
I don't recall whether I told him that or not.
The only thing you recall about your conversation was that you told him it was an account under the control of a U.S. person.
Yeah, unless you can refresh my memory better, that's all I remember.
Any other people in the State Department who were aware of your full-service operation?
I don't know specific. You asked me what did Ambassador Abrams know? Okay, he knew enough to turn to me for those things. He knew enough that he and I could talk about these issues. And I don't see anything wrong with him knowing that. Unless I'm overly naive, it was appropriate for the Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs to be aware of what was going on. These were matters that affected the policy down there. If the Nicaraguan resistance wasn't going to survive, he was going to have a first-class disaster on his hands.
Let me sharpen my question. With whom else in the State Department, if anyone, did you discuss all or part of your full-service operation?
Well, let's see. One other person I can recall specifically is Mr. John Miller, who at the time worked in the can't recall the initials of the office, but it was the Office of Public Diplomacy, and he was aware of it. At least part of it.
Which part?
The public diplomacy aspect of it, and the effort to reach out and make contact with resistance leadership, the resistance leadership in a unity effort. He was certainly aware of that.
Any others at State Department?
Not that I can recall off the top of my head. Maybe we flipped another page where I got someone else's name on it.
How about the CIA? And let's proceed using titles.
Well, I think that the level of knowledge that Mr. Abrams had was certainly shared among people who were engaged in the Central American Task Force. I want to go back once again to intelligence. And I guess maybe I'd like to expand it out. I'm not trying to drag in a whole bunch of people in the Ollie North dragnet here, but the National Intelligence Daily that is published every single day by the CIA, except I think Sunday, is provided to the intelligence committees up here. And there was ample indication, frequently, that there was resupply going on from 1984 through 1986. And so there were a lot of people who knew that something was happening. Now, I don't know if the intelligence that was being seen by the CIA actually had my name in it, aside from those issues that Director Casey brought up with me directly. But surely there were times when people pointed out to me that, oh, by the way, is that ship leaving country X headed for country Y? And I'd say yes. And they knew enough to call me about that. So Director Casey had specific and detailed knowledge because I briefed him frequently in detail. Below his level, I would guess the knowledge got thinner as further down the ladder you went until you got to the Central American Task Force. And within the Central American Task Force, there were people who had much more specific knowledge than in the intervening layers.
And did you ever discuss with the chief of the Central American Task Force the specifics of your role in the Contra resupply operation?
Yes.
How frequently?
As necessary.
I take it more than once.
Yes.
Is it more like once a week?
I don't know. I would guess that there were occasions that were perhaps weekly. It wasn't necessary to do it weekly, so much as it was just to get a feel for how things were moving.
Now, I'd like you to turn to a document which has been marked Exhibit 98A. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
And I'd like you to turn to the second page of it, and I don't want you to read anything from it. My first question is whether that is the list of items that you referred to in your testimony yesterday.
No, but that is certainly a list. The one I was referring to yesterday was at some later point with greater specificity. But it's the same type of thing.
And this one does, I take it, record items discussed at a meeting with the chief of the Central American Task Force.
Well, if you're talking about page 1, it's a telephone call, apparently. Are we talking about the 6 August 1000 entry?
No.
I'm sorry.
98A.
Oh, excuse me. That's the list.
And I take it that records subjects discussed at a meeting with, among other people, the chief of the Central American Task Force.
That is correct.
And I take it on the second page, there is a list of items that you discussed, including payments to various Contra leaders, and then air ops at the bottom.
That's correct.
And air ops, what does that refer to?
Aircraft resupply, parachuting supplies and flying them into Nicaragua to support the Nicaraguan resistance.
This is the resupply operation which was being run by General Secourt.
And by the resistance itself, yes.
How about the vice president? Was he aware of your role in the Contra resupply operation?
If he was, I didn't tell him.
How about people in his office?
Well, I don't know what, the only other person I ever talked to in his office at any rate of frequency was Mr. Don Gregg, and I don't know what he knew. He had much more frequent contact with another person who was down there.
Would you turn to Exhibit 99? You have that in front of you.
I do.
It's dated 10/5/86. I take it that's immediately after the shoot-down of the Hassifus plane?
I have to have my memory refreshed because I was overseas at the time, I think.
It's October 5th, 1986.
Well, again, I think I was overseas at the time.
There is a reference in Exhibit 99, which is on Office of the Vice President, stationery. C-123 equals Ollie.
I don't know what they called the C-123. I've never seen this document before in my life, Mr. Niels.
Did you ever discuss your resupply operation with Mr. Gregg or Mr. Watson in the Office of the Vice President?
I do not recall talking to Mr. Watson. I do recall talking to Mr. Gregg. I believe it was in terms of concern about Mr. Rodriguez. I don't recall going into any great detail with Mr. Gregg about it. It just may have slipped my mind. Obviously, somebody knew something while I was traveling around in Europe.
How about the Department of Defense, Southern Command? Were there people there with whom you discussed your role in the resupply operation?
Well, again, I don't think I made clear my role to people much below the level of Admiral Moreau, who had a detailed knowledge of it until he departed for another assignment in Europe. I know that several of the people who worked for him and his staff had some knowledge of what I was doing. There were occasionally people who I would see when I was traveling who were military officers when I would travel to Central America, who were American military officers. The ambassadors of those countries saw me. And on occasion, I'm not saying they saw me every time or that I specifically sought them out on every trip, but they did see me.
How about General Gorman?
I think General Gorman had a general idea of what I was doing. General Gorman had been the predecessor to Admiral Moreau at the Pentagon. I visited with him frequently, but I don't recall with these people sitting down and saying, oh, by the way, over the next 30 days, here's what Ollie North plans to do. What is more likely that I did is I sat down and I said, you know, over the course of the next 6 months, do these sound like good ideas for the Nicaraguan resistance? And what's your advice on how they should carry those things out? And so what I'm saying to you is that by inference, these people came to know what my role was in supporting the democratic opposition in Nicaragua, both military as well as political, and in trying to engender support for it from countries in the region as well as in Europe.
Would you turn to Exhibit 102? Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
And are those your notes of a conversation with General Gorman on the 19th of February, 1985?
They certainly appear to be. That is my writing or a copy of it.
Now it says there, you've written there, told him...
No. FR told his priority should be FDN. Told him in delicate stage of transition from blank run op to blank run op, with LERPs and PROW. And I can't read beyond that because it's all scratched out.
Well, you put in some blanks. You said blank in 2 places. There's nothing classified about either of those words. One of them is CIA. One of them is CIA, and the other is Southern Command. A delicate stage of transition from CIA run op to Southern Command run op.
Right. That's referring to the country in which FR was living, and I thought that that was a classified program. It has nothing to do with the Nicaraguan resistance. The Nicaraguan only entry regarding the Nicaraguan resistance is the letters FDN. And what General Gorman was trying to do was to get FR away from those 2 items on the bottom,
so
which were an approved activity. I thought they were classified in support of military operations in that country. So authorized, appropriated monies being used for it. And what he was trying to do is get FR the heck away from those 2 activities. And I don't blame him for that, because he saw a problem there, and I happen to agree with him. He's, after all, a 4-star general, and what he was trying to do is to have me back him up, because that's what he was trying to accomplish.
Was the President of the United States aware of the fact that you were running a resupply operation in Nicaragua?
Again, I have absolutely no idea of what the President's knowledge specifically about what I was doing. I made every effort to keep my superiors fully apprised as to what I was doing and the effect that it was having in the region. And you have tons of documents taken from me, some of which I personally surrendered to you and you alone, and others that were taken from my files that make that abundantly clear. I don't know to this day what the President knew I personally was doing. I hope to God that people were keeping him apprised as to the effect of it. Because if we hadn't done it, there wouldn't have been a Nicaraguan resistance around when the Congress got around to putting up $100 million for it. Sir.
Did you obtain from Mr. Dutton a book of photographs?
From who? Oh, yes, I did.
And did you tell him that you were wanted that book of, and this was, I take it, a book of photographs of various aspects of the resupply operation?
That's correct.
Planes.
And other things, too. I don't recall specifically what was in the book then, but that is correct.
And did you tell him that you wanted that book so that you would have something to show the President about the good work that they were doing?
I'm not sure that I put it that way. I want to get away from this. Ollie North wanted to get the credit stuff, because I didn't. I think what I wanted to do was to, if I said something to that effect, I think the President ought to see this. And I think I made an effort to send it up to the President through the National Security Advisor. And I don't know whether it ever got to the President or not, but if the book is still around, somebody ought to send it to him. Because the President ought to be aware of what a handful of people did to keep the Nicaraguan resistance alive at a time when nobody in this Congress seemed to care. And it's important that the President know that good men gave inordinate amounts of time, and some gave their lives to support that activity. And some of them have been brutally treated by what has come about in these 2 parallel investigations. Brutally treated.
How did you go about making efforts?
Yes.
How did you go about making efforts?
I would like to correct something I just said, Mr. Chairman. I apologize to those who did care, because there were many members of this body who cared a lot. And eventually a majority cared again and chose to appropriate $100 million to support that resistance. And I apologize to those of you who have backed them all the way. And I pray to God you will not stop because of what I have done or what I have failed to do. I desperately believe that if nothing else comes of these hearings, that you will have sufficient reason to vote again to appropriate monies to that cause. And I ask your apologies for overstating what I just did.
On that point, May we take a 10-minute recess?
Okay. Colonel North in the final moments there, being advised by his lawyer, by his personal lawyer, that there is nothing to be gained in a congressional hearing by insulting the men who are investigating him. And so he withdraws what he regarded as his overstated remarks about the lack of caring he believed that existed in the United States Congress for what he calls the democratic resistance in Central America, what most of us know as the Contras, the Nicaraguan Contras. Once again this afternoon, the Colonel very passionately on a number of occasions displaying on his sleeve and for all to see and hear his belief in the resupply operation, the diversion of funds from the arms sales to Iran to the Contras in Central America. And we will come back in just a moment to discuss where we think the council is going and what Colonel Oliver North has done so far. First, a word from your local station. For the first time, if we can have a look at the White House, please. Not for the first time today do we hear from Colonel North that President Reagan was not aware, at least as far as direct conversation between the President and Colonel North, of what was going on in terms of supplying the Contras in Central America. But Colonel North did say there, those are obviously members of the White House staff there to greet the President, who was coming back from a trip to Connecticut. Colonel North said he didn't personally want the credit, but he wanted the President to see and be aware of what a handful of people did to keep the Contras alive when the Congress didn't care. That was his first statement. And then, as you know, Colonel North apologized to members of Congress, saying that some of them did care. At least seen from this particular vantage point, Brit Hume is going to join us in a moment from Capitol Hill. What appears to be happening is twofold. First of all, the counsel for the House committee, John Neal, seems to be building a web at which, as I think most of us have known in the past, Colonel North was deemed to be very much at the center in terms of resupplying the Contras in Central America. And he also appears to be trying to elucidate from Colonel North and trying to illustrate again just how many people in the Reagan administration or in the State Department, Department of Defense, and the CIA knew of these operations at the time. And thirdly, if we assess it correctly, the questioning is intended to establish whether Colonel North, as a member of the National Security Council, was in violation of the Boland Amendment, which during the years latter part of 1984 and 85 said that no funds should be made available to the Contras, to those people supporting directly or indirectly the Contras. Mrs. Reagan there to greet the President. In other words, trying to establish, the President says we'll hear from when the hearings are over, trying to establish this afternoon whether or not Colonel North was running an operation that was in violation of law. Let us go to Capitol Hill and see whether Brit Hume agrees with that rather shoddy assessment. I apologize, Brit, or if you see anything more specific.
Well, Peter, I think that everything you've said is correct. I would think that there's been a point of emphasis here that's worth noting on all the people who may have known about the operation. Particularly named, I think, Peter, and particularly importantly named, were CIA Director Casey and Elliot Abrams. I thought it was quite interesting, Peter, that when the question about Elliot Abrams and did he know specifically about what you were doing was asked, there was a brief, solemn consultation between North and his lawyer, after which North said, yes, I think so. And I think that's obviously a dark moment for Elliot Abrams, who has insisted he had very little, if any, specific knowledge of what was going on. Again and again, we heard that CIA Director Casey did, and not very long ago, North said that he briefed him regularly. And you do get the impression, Peter, at least I do, that Director Casey really was kind of the godfather of all this. At least that's an impression that comes through.
Well, you certainly get an impression, I think, that Director Casey was very much Colonel Oliver North's patron in the administration. Is that unfair?
I don't think that's a bit unfair, Peter, and I rather suspect that when the members get their turn, that there will be a lot of questioning about the relationship between the two of them, because clearly Casey's name comes up again and again as someone who knew, as someone who directed the shredding or directed that the shredding be begun, as someone who gave North the logbook in which he entered all the expenses with the traveler's checks that we heard about earlier, and as someone who, of course, who later said you better go and shred that as well. So he becomes a kind of key figure. North